The impossible raid that haunted Japan's generals. You know what's crazy? There's a moment in World War II where American bombers hit Tokyo, and when Japanese military commanders looked at their maps and did the math, they realized something terrifying. It was literally impossible. The attack shouldn't have happened. But it did, and what they said afterward reveals just how much that single raid changed everything. April 18, 1942. Japan was on top of the world. They'd smashed Pearl Harbor just 4 months earlier. Their empire stretched across the Pacific like they owned it. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines all fallen. Their navy was the most powerful force in the ocean and their homeland, untouchable, protected by thousands of miles of water. Japanese citizens went about their lives in Tokyo that Saturday morning with zero fear. Why would they? The nearest American base was so far away that even their own military strategists had calculated it was safe. The math was simple. American bombers didn't have the range, they just didn't. To hit Tokyo and make it back to a friendly base, you'd need a bomber that could fly something like 5,000 miles round trip. Those didn't exist. General Sugiyama Hajime, the chief of the Army General Staff, had literally told Emperor Hirohito that the home islands were secure from air attack. The Imperial Navy's Admiral Nagano Asami agreed. Their defensive perimeter was too vast. Any American carrier that got close enough to launch planes would be detected and destroyed by their patrols. It was basic military logic. So when air raid sirens started wailing across Tokyo just after noon that day, most people thought it was another drill. They'd been having lots of drills lately, nothing to worry about. Then the bombs started falling. 16 American B-25 bombers roared over the city at rooftop level. They hit factories, they hit fuel depots, they hit military installations. The explosions echoed across Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya. For the first time since maybe the Mongols tried to invade in the 1200s, foreign attackers had struck the Japanese mainland. The physical damage wasn't massive. About 50 people died, some buildings burned. In the grand scale of the war, it was almost nothing compared to what would come later, but that's not what mattered. What mattered was the shock. Lieutenant General Torishiro Kawabe was in a meeting when the bombs hit. Years later, he'd recall the absolute confusion in that room. Officers were shouting, trying to figure out where these planes came from. They pulled out maps. They did calculations. Nothing made sense. Colonel Mitsuo Fuchida, the same guy who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, was actually in the hospital recovering from appendicitis when the raid happened. He watched through his window as the American bombers flew past. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. In his memoir, he wrote about the shame he felt. The absolute burning shame that the country he'd just helped strike was now striking back, and he was helpless in a hospital bed. But here's where it gets really interesting. The immediate reaction from Japan's military leadership wasn't just shock or shame, it was confusion bordering on panic. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor and commander of the combined fleet, was furious. Not just angry, furious. He'd been the one who promised the Imperial High Command that American carriers wouldn't get close enough to threaten the homeland. His reputation was built on being the strategic genius who understood modern naval warfare better than anyone. And now American bombers had just proven him wrong. The question driving everyone insane was simple: how? Intelligence officers scrambled, they interviewed witnesses, they examined bomb fragments, they studied the flight paths, and everything they learned made it worse. The bombers were B-25s, medium-range bombers. They'd flown in from the east from the ocean. That meant carriers, but the closest American base where carriers could have launched from and recovered these bombers was thousands of miles away. The math didn't work. B-25s couldn't fly that far. Lieutenant Colonel Takashiro Hattori, working in Army General Staff Headquarters, was tasked with figuring this out. His report kept coming back to the same impossible conclusion. These bombers had to have come from carriers, but they couldn't have returned to carriers. The fuel capacity just wasn't there. So where did they go? This is what haunted Japanese commanders. They realized that somehow the Americans had figured out a way to launch a one-way attack. The pilots had to have ditched somewhere or landed in China, which meant American aircrews were willing to fly a suicide mission just to hit Tokyo. That psychological impact hit harder than any bomb. General Tojo Hideki, the Prime Minister and War Minister, held an emergency cabinet meeting that same day. According to records from that meeting, Tojo's main concern wasn't the damage, it was the implication. If American bombers could reach Tokyo once, they could do it again. And next time, maybe they'd have fighters, maybe they'd have more bombers, maybe they'd figure out how to make it a two-way trip. The emperor had to be moved to a secure bunker during the raid. Think about that. The man they considered a living god had to hide underground because of American bombs. That image spread through the military command like poison. Admiral Yamamoto's chief of staff wrote in his diary that night. His entry is brutal in its honesty. He talked about the humiliation, about how the raid proved that their defensive calculations were flawed, about how if the Americans could do this with 16 bombers, what would they do with 100, with 1,000? But it gets worse for the Japanese command, because they still didn't know how it happened. Intelligence eventually pieced it together, but it took weeks. The Americans had done something nobody thought was possible. They'd loaded Army bombers planes designed to take off from runways onto an aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet. They'd stripped the planes down, modified them, trained pilots in short takeoff procedures that seemed insane, and they'd launched them from about 650 miles out. The bombers weren't supposed to come back. The plan from the beginning was to hit Japan and then fly to China, land at friendly airfields, and hope for the best. When Japanese intelligence finally confirmed this, the reaction was mixed. On one hand, relief. It wasn't some new super bomber. It was a crazy, one-off trick that probably couldn't be repeated easily. On the other hand, horror, because it meant the Americans were desperate enough or bold enough or crazy enough to try anything. Traditional military doctrine said you don't send bombers on one-way missions. You preserve your aircrew, you calculate losses and sustainability. The Americans had just thrown that rulebook out. Lieutenant General Cowwabe said something in a meeting after they'd figured out the raid's origins. A colleague recorded it. He said, "If they are willing to do this now when they are weak and defeated, what will they do when they grow strong?" That question hung over every strategic discussion for months. See, Japan's entire war strategy was based on an assumption. The assumption was that Americans were soft, that they valued individual lives too much, that after a few bloody defeats like Pearl Harbor, they'd negotiate peace and let Japan keep its empire. Nobody in Tokyo thought America would fight a total war, a war where everything was on the table. The Doolittle Raid, named after Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle who led it, shattered that assumption. And it triggered something else, something the Japanese military would later deeply regret. Admiral Yamamoto became obsessed with making sure this never happened again. He'd already been planning an operation to extend Japan's defensive perimeter, but now he pushed for it aggressively. He convinced the Naval General Staff that they needed to capture Midway Island. With Midway, they could detect American carriers much earlier. They could prevent another Tokyo raid. The push for Midway was rushed. Intelligence wasn't as thorough as it should have been, preparations weren't complete, but Yamamoto insisted. The shame of the Tokyo raid was driving him. You probably know what happened at Midway. June 1942, just 2 months after the Doolittle Raid. Japan sent its largest carrier force to capture this tiny island, and the Americans who'd broken Japanese naval codes were waiting. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers in one day, the cream of their naval aviation, pilots who'd trained for years, gone. The Battle of Midway turned the tide of the Pacific War. And it happened because Yamamoto was scrambling to prevent another raid like Doolittle's. But back to those immediate reactions in April 1942, because there's another layer to this. The Japanese military leadership had to save face. They had to explain to the emperor, to the government, to the public, how American bombers had just flown over the sacred homeland. So they lied. The official story released to the Japanese public was vague. The newspapers reported that enemy planes had attacked but were driven off with heavy losses. They claimed 9 bombers were shot down. In reality, only one B-25 was hit by Japanese fire during the entire raid, and it made it to China before crashing. They told the public the damage was minimal, which was true, and that the defenses had worked perfectly, which was a complete lie. Interior Minister Michio Yuzawa gave a radio address trying to calm public panic. He assured everyone that the military had everything under control, that this was a desperate last gasp from a failing enemy. But behind closed doors, he was demanding answers from the military about how this happened. The Kempeitai, Japan's military police, went into overdrive. They arrested anyone who spread rumors about the raid, anyone who suggested that maybe Japan wasn't invincible. Censorship clamped down hard. But you can't censor knowledge that spreads through the military itself. Officers who'd seen the raid with their own eyes talked to other officers. The truth spread through the ranks. American bombers had hit Tokyo and flown away untouched. The home islands weren't safe. Morale took a hit that the generals couldn't fix with propaganda. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, known for his brutal honesty in his memoirs, later wrote about the paranoia that set in after Doolittle. Every time there was an air raid drill, people wondered if it was real. Every time someone spotted an unidentified plane, panic rippled through commands. The psychological security was gone. And here's something most people don't know. The raid triggered a massive retaliation against China. Remember how those B-25s were supposed to land in China after hitting Japan? They did. Well, they tried. Most of the crews crash-landed or bilayed out over Chinese territory. Chinese civilians and guerrilla fighters helped many of the American airmen escape. When Japanese intelligence confirmed this, they were enraged. The Zhejiangjiangxi campaign was launched partly as punishment. Japanese forces swept through the Chinese provinces where the airmen had landed. They destroyed dozens of airfields so they could never be used again for raids on Japan. They killed an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians in retaliation. That's 250,000 people dead because Japan's military leadership was humiliated and wanted revenge. General Shunroku Hata, commanding the China Expeditionary Army, justified it in his reports. He said they had to make sure China could never support another raid on the homeland. The savagery of that campaign shows how deeply the Doolittle Raid had cut into Japanese military pride. Let's talk about what some of these leaders said in their own words, because the documentation is chilling. Admiral Yugaki's diary entry from April 18, 1942. Although the damage was small, it is a disgrace that the skies over the imperial capital should have been defiled without a single enemy plane being shot down. What can we do to maintain the nation's confidence in us? That line, defiled, shows how they viewed it. This wasn't just a military attack, it was a spiritual violation. Tojo, in a cabinet meeting, reportedly said, "We cannot allow the emperor to be endangered again. Whatever the cost, the home islands must be made absolutely secure." Whatever the cost, that phrase justified so many brutal decisions afterward. Prince Takamatsu, the emperor's brother and a naval officer, wrote in his diary, "The real issue is not the bombs that fell but the fact that they could fall at all. Our entire strategic framework has been called into question." He got it, the physical raid was nothing, the strategic implications were everything. Here's another thing that happened. The raid accelerated Japan's research into long-range detection systems. They poured resources into radar development, into early warning networks, into coastal defenses. Resources that could have gone to frontline combat units instead went to protecting the homeland from a threat that had already proven it could bypass all those defenses. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, after he recovered from his appendicitis, was assigned to investigate defensive failures. His report was scathing. He documented how patrol boats had spotted the American carrier task force early that morning but hadn't effectively communicated it. How fighter squadrons had scrambled too late, how anti-aircraft defenses were poorly coordinated. Heads rolled after that report, commands were reshuffled, officers were reassigned, some were quietly forced to retire. The military brass needed scapegoats. But the person they really blamed was Yamamoto, even though they couldn't say it publicly. He was too important, too respected. But privately, some in the Army General Staff whispered that his defensive plan had failed, that his assurances were hollow. This created a rift between the Army and Navy that never really healed. The Army blamed the Navy for letting carriers get close. The Navy blamed the Army for not having better air defenses over the homeland. This inter-service rivalry would plague Japanese military operations for the rest of the war. Now let's fast forward a bit. After the war ended, many of these leaders were captured, interrogated, or interviewed. American intelligence officers wanted to know everything about Japanese decision-making, and the Doolittle Raid came up again and again. Former Prime Minister Tojo, during his war crimes trial, was asked about the raid. He admitted that it had been a severe psychological blow that influenced subsequent operations. He tried to downplay his own reaction, but prosecutors had documents showing he'd personally ordered the retaliatory campaign in China. Admiral Toyota Somu, who later commanded the combined fleet, testified that the raid had introduced an element of doubt into Japanese strategic planning. Before Doolittle, they believed they had time to consolidate their empire. After Doolittle, they knew America could strike anytime, anywhere. Captain Fuchida, who survived the war, was remarkably candid in his interviews. He said the raid made them realize that we had poked a dragon and it was angrier than we thought possible. But here's maybe the most revealing post-war comment. It comes from Admiral Somu Toyota in a 1949 interview. He said, "We spent the rest of the war wondering what else they might try. Every plan had to account for American unpredictability. We could not afford another surprise like that." Think about that, one raid with 16 bombers, minimal damage, but it made Japan's entire military leadership paranoid for the rest of the war. They started second-guessing everything. Were the Americans developing new bombers, new carriers, new tactics? Intelligence resources got diverted trying to figure out what crazy plan America would try next. And the thing is, the Americans did keep coming up with crazy plans. Island-hopping campaigns that bypassed strongpoints, submarine warfare that strangled supply lines, and eventually B-29 superfortresses that could actually make the round trip to Japan from bases in the Marianas. When those B-29s started showing up in 1944, Japanese commanders had a weird reaction. On one hand, it was worse than the Doolittle Raid because these planes kept coming, night after night, burning cities to ash. On the other hand, it was almost a relief because at least it made sense. Big bombers flying from known bases following conventional doctrine. The Doolittle Raid had been terrifying specifically because it broke all the rules. Let's get into some of the specific conversations that happened in those first hours and days after the raid, because Japanese records preserved some of this. When news reached Yamamoto aboard his flagship, the battleship Yamato, witnesses said he went silent for a long time. Then he reportedly said to his staff, "Our defenses are not what I thought they were. We need to push the Americans back further immediately." That led directly to his Midway obsession. At Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the scene was chaos. Junior officers were running reports up the chain. Senior officers were demanding information nobody had. Someone had to brief the emperor and nobody wanted that job. Finally, General Sugiyama and Admiral Nagano went together. The emperor, according to court records, asked simple questions. How did this happen? How many enemy planes? What is the damage? Can it happen again? Sugiyama tried to explain the carrier theory. The emperor interrupted him. "You told me our defenses were adequate. Were you wrong, or did the Americans develop new capabilities?" That question didn't have a good answer. Either the generals had miscalculated or American technology had leaped forward. Both options were bad. The emperor dismissed them without further comment, which in Japanese court culture was basically a severe reprimand. In the days that followed, meetings at Imperial General Headquarters got heated. The Army wanted more resources for homeland defense. The Navy wanted more resources to hunt American carriers. Both couldn't be fully funded. Arguments broke out. Colonel Tsuji, who sat in on some of these meetings, later wrote that he saw senior officers, men who'd served together for decades, nearly come to blows over resource allocation. The Doolittle Raid had revealed cracks in the military structure that stress made worse. There's also the propaganda problem Japanese leaders faced. They'd spent months telling their people that the war was going great, that America was weak and defeated, that Japan was invincible. Now bombers had hit Tokyo. How do you spin that? The solution was to lie, but also to channel the public's reaction toward hatred of America. Newspapers ran stories about the cowardly attack on civilian areas, even though most bombs hit military or industrial targets. They portrayed Doolittle's raiders as war criminals for indiscriminate bombing, a charge that rings pretty hollow considering what Japan had done in China. But it worked on some level. Japanese public anger toward America intensified, which is what the military wanted: unity through hatred. However, smart people in Tokyo saw through it. Intellectuals, business leaders, even some lower-ranking officers privately wondered, if we're winning so decisively, why did they just bomb us? The Kempei's arrest logs from late April and early May 1942 show a spike in defeatist talk investigations. People were being arrested for asking questions. One interesting detail from the historical record: several Japanese civilians in Tokyo and other bombed cities actually cheered during the raid. Not many, but some. These were people who opposed the war, who'd been silenced by militarism, who saw the American bombs as a sign that maybe Japan's military leadership wasn't invincible after all. The Kempeitai came down on these people hard, very hard. This created another problem for military leaders. They now had to worry about internal dissent on top of everything else. Resources got diverted to internal security. The fear of domestic opposition became another drain on the war effort, all traceable back to the psychological shock of the Doolittle Raid. Let's talk about some of the individual bombers' impacts because each one had ripple effects. 1 B-25 bombed the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. That facility was building parts for aircraft carriers. Production was disrupted for weeks, not because of major damage but because workers had to be evacuated during the raid, security had to be increased afterward, and morale took a hit. Productivity dropped, schedules slipped, ships under construction got delayed. Another bomber hit near a steel mill in Kawasaki. Again, physical damage was minor, but the psychological impact on workers was huge. Many requested transfers to facilities further inland. Labor shortages hit that mill for months. These weren't things American planners had even considered when they launched the raid. They were just trying to hit any targets they could. But the secondary effects cascaded through Japan's war economy. Factory managers started demanding protection. Business leaders wanted assurances from the government that it wouldn't happen again. The military couldn't give those assurances, which damaged the government's relationship with industrial leaders. This is fascinating from a strategic perspective. 16 bombers caused barely any physical destruction but generated massive economic and political friction inside Japan just by proving the homeland was vulnerable. Meanwhile, Japanese forces in China were executing that brutal retaliation campaign. They destroyed 50-plus airfields, they massacred villagers who'd helped American airmen, they burned entire towns. And the irony? The Chinese airfields they destroyed were in such poor condition that the Americans never planned to use them again anyway. The B-25s that landed there did so in emergencies, not by design. Most crashed because the fields were inadequate. So Japan slaughtered 250,000 Chinese civilians to neutralize a threat that didn't actually exist. All because military leaders needed to do something, anything, to feel like they'd responded to the humiliation of the Doolittle Raid. General Hata's reports back to Tokyo justified the campaign in terms of denying the enemy future bases, but everyone knew what it really was: revenge, pure revenge. Some junior officers in China were reportedly disturbed by the scale of the retaliation. Diaries and letters that survived show soldiers questioning why they were burning villages full of civilians who had nothing to do with military operations. But orders were orders. The brutality continued for months. This is one of the darkest aspects of the post-Doolittle period. The raid itself killed about 50 Japanese people, mostly by accident. Japan's response killed 250,000 Chinese. The proportionality was insane, but military honor had been stained and blood was needed to wash it clean. Let's jump to the operational changes Japan made. New patrol zones were established, pushing hundreds of miles further out. Small ships, submarines, patrol boats, all deployed in a massive early warning net. This stretched Japan's naval resources thin at a time when they needed every ship for offensive operations elsewhere. Fighter squadrons were pulled back to defend the home islands. Planes that should have been supporting frontline troops in the Pacific or Southeast Asia were instead sitting on runways in Japan, waiting for another raid that wouldn't come for 2 more years. It was a massive resource misallocation driven entirely by fear. The Army and Navy also finally started coordinating on air defense, something they'd resisted before due to inter-service rivalry. Integrated air defense commands were established. Radar stations were built. Communication systems were upgraded. All of this cost money and resources Japan didn't really have. Their economy was already stretched supporting military operations across Asia and the Pacific. Now they had to divert resources to protect against a threat that might never materialize again, at least not in the same form. Some historians argue that the defensive buildup after Doolittle actually weakened Japan's overall strategic position. By going defensive on the homeland, they gave up some of their offensive momentum in the Pacific. And Midway, oh Midway, we have to come back to Midway because it's so central to understanding the impact of the Doolittle Raid on Japanese decision-making. Yamamoto's push for the Midway operation was aggressive, some would say reckless. He overruled concerns from his own staff. He dismissed intelligence suggesting the Americans knew about the plan. He was absolutely convinced that Japan needed to push its defensive perimeter out to prevent another carrier raid on Tokyo. The plan was to seize Midway, draw out the American carriers, and destroy them in one decisive battle. Then Tokyo would be safe, then the shame would be erased. It's hard to overstate how much the Doolittle Raid influenced this thinking. Without Doolittle, would Yamamoto have pushed so hard for Midway? Maybe eventually, but probably not in June 1942 when preparations were rushed and incomplete. And we know what happened. American codebreakers had read Japan's plans. American carriers were waiting in ambush. Japanese carriers were caught with their planes on deck being refueled and rearmed. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were doomed. A fourth was sunk later that day. Japan lost Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, 4 of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Navy never recovered from Midway. They'd lost not just the ships but the experienced aircrew, the mechanics, the coordinated strike capability that had made them dominant. And it all traced back, at least in part, to the humiliation of April 18, 1942. Some Japanese officers recognized this connection even during the war. Admiral Yugaki wrote in his diary after Midway, "We were impatient. We wanted to erase the stain on our honor too quickly, and we paid for it." After the war, when historians could analyze Japanese records and interview surviving commanders, the link became even clearer. Multiple officers cited the Doolittle Raid as a psychological turning point that led to strategic mistakes. Captain Fuchida put it bluntly in his post-war writings, Doolittle's raid drove Yamamoto to Midway and Midway destroyed us. Now, we should talk about how this impacted Japan's approach to the broader war. Before Doolittle, Japanese strategy was somewhat coherent. Expand the empire, consolidate gains, defend the perimeter, force America to negotiate peace. There was a logic to it, even if it was based on flawed assumptions about American resolve. After Doolittle, paranoia crept in. Plans became reactive instead of proactive. Resources got diverted to defensive measures. Unity of command fractured as Army and Navy bickered over responsibility for homeland defense. The Japanese military leadership started making decisions based on fear rather than strategy, and fear is a terrible basis for military planning. You can see it in how they deployed forces. Too many units held back in Japan or nearby areas instead of being sent to critical fronts. Too many resources spent on fortifications that never got tested. Too much effort put into intercepting threats that didn't exist yet. There's a concept in military strategy called defending everywhere. It means you're so worried about being hit that you spread your forces thin trying to protect everything, and you end up protecting nothing effectively. That's what Japan started doing after Doolittle. The Americans, meanwhile, were concentrating force. They'd pick one objective, mass their resources, overwhelm Japanese defenders, and move on, island hopping. While Japan was defending everywhere, America was attacking somewhere. And every time the Americans advanced, Japanese planners would panic about the implications for homeland defense. When the Marianas fell in 1944, suddenly B-29s could reach Japan from the south. That triggered another round of defensive redeployments. By 1945, Japan had hundreds of thousands of troops sitting on the home islands preparing for an invasion. These were soldiers who could have fought in the Pacific, who could have defended key islands, who could have made American advances more costly. But they were at home, waiting for an invasion that ended up not happening conventionally because America dropped atomic bombs instead. It's impossible to know how things would have played out differently without the Doolittle Raid. History doesn't work that way, but we can say with certainty that the raid had strategic impacts far beyond the physical damage it caused. Japanese commanders said as much themselves in post-war analyses. The raid shifted their mindset from offensive to defensive. It made them doubt their own intelligence and planning. It created inter-service friction. It drove them toward risky operations like Midway to save face. All from 16 bombers that shouldn't have been able to reach Japan in the first place. There's something deeply human about the Japanese reaction. These were proud men leading a proud military culture. The idea that they could be touched, that their sacred homeland could be struck, went against everything they'd built their identity around. So they lashed out, they made emotional decisions, they let pride override tactical sense. War does that. It takes rational people and puts them in situations where emotion overwhelms calculation. The Doolittle Raid was a masterclass in psychological warfare, even though that wasn't really the primary intent. The Americans just wanted to hit back after Pearl Harbor. They wanted to prove they could. They wanted to boost morale at home. They accomplished all that, but they also accidentally triggered a chain reaction in Japanese military planning that arguably shortened the war. So what did Japanese military leaders say after the raid? They said a lot of things. In public, they minimized it and talked tough. In private, they admitted shock and fear. In their diaries and letters, they confessed humiliation and doubt. In their operational planning afterward, they revealed paranoia and desperation. The official statements were propaganda. The private conversations were more honest. The operational decisions were most revealing of all. Jimmy Doolittle himself didn't think the raid was particularly successful at first. When he got back to America, he actually thought he might be court-martialed because he'd lost all his aircraft and most of his crews were scattered across China. He'd accomplished the bombing run, but he hadn't brought his people home. Instead, he received the Medal of Honor, because American leadership understood something Doolittle himself didn't fully grasp yet. The raid's value wasn't in the bombs it dropped. It was in the message it sent and the reaction it provoked. Japan was vulnerable, Japan could be hit, Japan would be hit again. And the Japanese military leadership heard that message loud and clear. The rest of the war in many ways was shaped by their response to it. That's the real story of the Doolittle Raid, not the heroic bomber crews, though they were genuinely heroic, not the bombs falling on Tokyo, though that was dramatic. The real story is what happened inside Japanese military headquarters in the hours, days, weeks, and months after those bombs fell. It's a story about how psychological shock can reshape strategy, how humiliation can drive mistakes, how a small action can have massive consequences if it hits the right pressure point at the right time. 16 planes, 80 men, a one-way mission that shouldn't have worked. And it changed the Pacific War. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from World War II.